For nearly a quarter of a century, we have lived in a world where cloning is possible. Yes, we had crossed many boundaries before that and done some very limited forms of cloning. But the idea of taking a DNA strand from an adult animal and being able to produce an exact copy of that animal seemed to be just science fiction. And yet it always seemed like a science fiction that was within our reach, so that it's no surprise that in the Jurassic Park film, that even though we hadn't crossed that barrier yet in real life, the real issue for them is not the cloning, but the dino DNA. Of course, it should be noted there are many other obstacles that are in our way. Even if some time traveler handed us a vial of dinosaur DNA and said to have at it, we don't have the means to go from that to a fully grown dinosaur. But that's just a technical problem, and while I don't want to fall into the trap of scientists were wrong about one thing, therefore they're wrong about this too, but the point really is that as long as we don't have the dino DNA, then that whole issue is moot. Maybe these are technical issues we can get past. Maybe they're not. But unless we have the dino DNA, it doesn't really matter. We can sit around and debate whether or not we have the engineering skill to construct an alien spacecraft from their blueprints, but so long as we don't have their unobtainium, what does it matter in the first place? We can't do it. The question is, where could you possibly get the dinosaur DNA from? And this was a question already being considered, which we'll explore in this video. Our story begins with Dr. John Tkach. Like Michael Crichton, he was a medical doctor, but wasn't content to merely practice medicine. Tkach was enthusiastic about dinosaurs, especially at the time our story takes place, 1980, when the views of dinosaurs were changing. Vanishing were the views that dinosaurs had brains the size of a walnut, that they needed a second brain elsewhere to control their body, that the biggest could only live partially submerged to offset their enormous weight, or that they walked fully upright, dragging their tails. But with all these changes, one question was still hard to satisfactorily answer. Why did they all die out so suddenly? Tkach thought that it might have been due to disease, that birds, recently considered in a radical theory to be related to dinosaurs, had an adaptive means of coping with infection that dinosaurs didn't have. But there was no proof for this. The answer might be found in dinosaur genetic material, but of course, there wasn't any around. Fossils can tell you a lot of things, but in the end, they are just rocks. They can't even tell you the color, never mind anything as complex as DNA. But Tkach had a sudden flash of inspiration. Normal fossils replace all the organic material with rock, but there was a notable exception to that. Amber, fossilized tree sap. Was it possible that the transformation of the sap into amber didn't affect anything else inside the amber? Meaning that if there were a formerly living creature inside it, it could potentially still be intact? Tkach thought so. What's more, if it was carrying the cells of another creature, such as a white blood cell with an intact nucleus, then the genetic code could actually be intact within the body of that organism, such as a fly or a mosquito. He was very excited by the possibilities of this, and it turns out that he wasn't the only one. In fact, he wasn't even the first to have the idea. Charles Pellegrino wasn't a medical doctor, but he was an author like Crichton, although he was inspired more by Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke. Pellegrino had numerous scientific interests, including the possibility of an interstellar spaceship, the implications of the death of all insects, and the Titanic. In 1977, Pellegrino, who worked at the Smithsonian at the time, was invited to do some exploring in a huge amber deposit located in New Jersey, with samples dating all the way back to the Cretaceous age. But more importantly, while working with Paul Wygodinsky from the Museum of Natural History in New York, they discovered what Tkach would later theorize might be true was indeed correct. Amber seemed to mummify the organism within. In fact, the examination revealed that it was almost like a science fiction stasis field, like the creature had died the day before. It was so well preserved. Realizing the possibility of studying extinct life, Pellegrino made a shocking discovery during his search for fossils. 2 lumps of amber containing biting insects that were clearly dated to the Cretaceous age. He realized the implication. He had previously considered studying the insects and the bacteria that they contained, but if the insects had bitten an animal, and the number one candidate would be a dinosaur, then he could literally be holding dinosaur DNA in the palm of his hand. Pellegrino did the only thing that an excited, up-and-coming radical thinker could do when given that kind of an opportunity. He put them in a fridge and left them there. As exciting as the idea might be, one of the things to remember is that there are some fields of science that allow you plenty of room to experiment, and some of them that you can only ever do once. Recall in Jurassic Park when the dig team in Montana used a computer to study the site and comment that after some refinement, we won't even need to dig anymore. Well, think about the implication of that. It means you can study a site without ever excavating it, which I can't emphasize enough how important that is, because you can only ever excavate a site once. So if you don't excavate it, you can keep studying it with newer and newer techniques and with the benefits of advances in paleontology and evolutionary theory. The city of Troy was studied in so primitive a manner that some of the excavation was done with dynamite. Who knows what could have been learned if the site had instead been studied using 21st century techniques instead of explosives. Pellegrino understood that and realized that, for all they knew, these 2 were the only samples from the age of dinosaurs that they might ever find, and that the responsible thing to do was to save them for the future, when the technology had been perfected, before trying to open them up and see what might be inside. Both Tkach and Pellegrino had reached their conclusions independently, but both ran into exactly the same problem. Their ideas were just too radical. Both tried publishing papers on the topic. Neither could get a publisher willing to do it. All it was just a theory. And it went up against what molecular paleontologists were finding, a profound lack of genetic material in fossils, and the idea that when an organism dies, the organism begins to break itself down. The idea that a sample existed intact in the stomach of an insect, which exists to break down those very items, sounded pretty implausible. Pellegrino could find no one willing to even humor him, actually. Tkach eventually made contact with Alan Wilson at Berkeley, who found it intriguing to consider, but unlikely to lead to any actual results. Things finally changed in 1982. George Poinar, an expert on insects, and Roberta Hess, an expert in microscopy, had spent 2 years studying a mycetophyllid fly, preserved in 40-million-year-old amber. They found the subject was indeed as preserved as Wygozinski and Pellegrino had suspected. The insect's breathing apparatus, called the tracheoles, was completely intact. No sign at all that this creature dated back to when Australia was just breaking away from Antarctica. Further exploration revealed things like mitochondria, organelles, and nuclei that were all intact. They published their findings in the journal Science, and then continued their work, now attempting this on a wasp dating back to the Cretaceous age, and again seeing the same results. Strong evidence that the fly that they'd worked with was not a fluke, but proof that amber allowed for the preservation of soft tissues during fossilization. And while they said nothing in public, they privately speculated about the possibilities of preserved prehistoric genetic structure. This provided enough legitimacy for Pellegrino, who finally was given the opportunity in the January 1985 issue of Omni magazine to publish his idea. In an article entitled Dinosaur Capsule, he explained about the amber that he found, about the means that the sap becomes amber, and how that prevents the transmission of minerals through the material to ever reach and replace the insect within. He speculated about the possibility of finding not just the insect or the bacteria DNA, but that of dinosaurs, and suggested that even an incomplete strand could be of use, that they could borrow from existing animals to fill in the holes in order to attempt to create a viable DNA strand. And most intriguing, he made the observation that the bones of a Tyrannosaurus rex was found less than 200 yards away from where he found the amber. Not actually suggestive in and of itself. The T-Rex hadn't even existed when this particular lump of amber was created. But it put the idea in mind that two ancient creatures were found within a few city blocks of each other. One, the most famous dinosaur that ever lived, and the other, a time capsule that may contain the seed to regrow an extinct animal. In his article, Pellegrino talks about the work of Poinar and Hess, as well as Wilson from Berkeley and Russell Higuchi, a molecular biologist, and refers to them as members of the Extinct DNA Study Group. In discussing bacteria and the need to acknowledge the potential threat that it represents, some of the preservation is in fact so good, the bacteria inside the amber is still alive. But he then makes the following statement, quote, "One scientist in the study group has already suggested that viral and bacterial infections contributed to the extinction of the dinosaurs." The theory that Tkach was pursuing? Oh yes, because it's a virtual certainty that he is the person Pellegrino is referring to. When Poinar and Hess published their article, Tkach was excited to finally see scientific validation for his idea, and reached out to Poinar. After a bit of discussion, Poinar suggested that they form a study group, and the Extinct DNA Study Group was born. Tkach put out a newsletter to the collection of scientists, and it was about far more than just dinosaur DNA, but the chance to re-examine the prehistoric past using all the cutting-edge microbiology and paleontology knowledge that they had. The problem was that what they wanted to do was so radical and so far removed from the conventional efforts that recruiting scientists into the study group proved difficult. They were worried about having their professional reputations damaged by association with a fringe idea, especially because Tkach was quite certain and vocal in his belief that they could turn back the clock and bring a dinosaur into the modern age. But the study group quickly realized that while something like that was a worthwhile goal at some point, they needed to start with something easier. Again, no one wants to be the one in the history books that dynamited Troy. So they began with work on the DNA of more recent extinct animals until they were studying a species that had been dead for a mere 100 years, the quagga, to see what could be learned from a species recent enough to have some information but still with open questions left. They also soon found a new colleague in Svante Pääbo, a Swedish scientist now considered one of the founders of the field of paleogenetics. He does work on the study of human development by examining DNA from preserved humans and hominids, such as Egyptian mummies and prehistoric people preserved in ice. So impressive was his body of work that he sent an article for publication to Wilson in Berkeley, who in the field of microbiology, well, Wilson was a living legend. Receiving a letter back from him was a real honor. It also completely floored him, because Wilson asked if he could visit Professor Pääbo to discuss his work and perhaps spend his sabbatical year working in the good professor's laboratory. Well, actually, he was only a grad student. He was hoping to get a job working for Wilson after defending his doctorate. So this was the professional equivalent of having Neil deGrasse Tyson come over to your house to do the dishes. When things were finally straightened out, Pääbo was given a job working for Wilson at Berkeley, where the group was starting to garner more positive and wider attention, until a very unexpected phone call came that would ensure hundreds of millions of people would know exactly what they were doing. During the early days of the Extinct DNA Study Group, they were approached by Michael Crichton. Unbeknownst to them, Crichton had been working on a story about a genetically engineered dinosaur for a while, but he had some reservations about that. He spoke to the group mostly on the subject of the preservation possibilities of amber, and after a fruitful conversation, left. that seemed to be the end of it. They didn't hear anything more from him until a phone call at the start of the 90s informing them that Poinar and Hess, as well as the entire Extinction DNA Study Group, was mentioned in the acknowledgments of Crichton's novel Jurassic Park. In later editions, Pellegrino's name would also be added. And amazingly, this might just be what has helped cause an explosion of knowledge about the past. The implications of what the group was talking about helped Michael Crichton have the vehicle to tell his tale, a tale with such potential the film rights were bought before it was even published. The film was a massive hit, and its use of the most current understanding of dinosaurs helped inspire what some would call the Jurassic Park effect, that the number of people wanting to study dinosaurs and help support studies of dinosaurs shot up tremendously. The time when Pellegrino and Tkach were developing their ideas was called the Dinosaur Renaissance, but instead it might be considered a revolution, to move people from the picture on the left to the picture on the right, to change our understanding of dinosaurs so much the cutting-edge knowledge that made Jurassic Park was obsolete. But what about the dream that started this journey? The idea that dinosaurs could return to life and walk among us? Well, it seems that the critics are still right. There have been a couple of instances where paleontologists have claimed to have found soft tissue in dinosaur fossils. But so far, what should be a shocking, revolutionary discovery has not found traction in the scientific community for a number of reasons, including the possibility this isn't even dinosaur material at all. Studies of DNA have demonstrated a half-life of about 521 years. That is, half of the DNA strands will break down in that length of time, creating a theoretical limit of 6.8 million years. And as for the other efforts, well, the quagga that is being described right now isn't really a quagga. It's just a breed of zebra that has been created thanks to selective breeding to look like a quagga. And even talks about bringing back the mammoth are talking about using mammoth DNA to alter the characteristics of an elephant to create a creature with mammoth-like characteristics, not simply cloning it from the ground up. So, we're not bringing extinct animals back. Does that mean that it was all for nothing? Absolutely not. We've found new techniques to study the past. We've invented whole new fields of science as a result of what we've learned. And the fruits of this effort has now inspired an entire generation to go into science. Maybe it all was just a dream, but dreams can lead to awakening.